My title today is Language as a Biocultural Niche and Social Institution. As you will know, a major theme which has run through my lectures so far has been the importance of integrating a life sciences and biological perspective on language with a social perspective on language. And in this lecture, I directly address this from the point of view of addressing the nature of language itself, its ontology, and its nature as an object of study and as a part of the human ecological niche. Here are some propositions that I want to convince you of. Firstly, that the biology of language needs to be understood in both evolutionary and ecological terms. Secondly, that language is a biocultural niche and an ecological artifact. Thirdly, that grammar is not innate. And fourthly, that language is a social, semiotic, and normative institution and can be formally so defined and analyzed. Traditionally, in the human sciences, there has been an opposition between culture and nature. In this traditional paradigm, culture, like language, is considered to be uniquely human. And therefore, language can be either considered to be part of a unique human nature, as in nativist theories, or part of a unique human culture, as in environmentalist theories, or else it is considered that there is an interaction between the two, as it were, between genes and environment, so that it's part of both. And language learning is viewed as the exposure of an organism to an input which the learner must internalize. Language is viewed in some kind of sense as being fundamentally external to the language user and learner. There are some problems with this. The first problem, which I alluded to in an earlier lecture, is that the human genome, we know since the publication of the results of the Human Genome Project, is not sufficiently unique for nativism, at least in my eyes, to be plausible. There is a 95 to 98% overlap between human and chimpanzee genomes in terms of their genetic material. There is absolutely no difference of orders of magnitude in the genetic material available for coding the language capacity. And I would suggest that this simple quantitative consideration makes it unlikely that the human language capacity is actually genetically encoded, at least in the sense that we're accustomed to thinking about that from Chomskyan generative linguistics. However, if we view language as part of culture, we also run into certain problems. And the main problem is that culture is actually not uniquely human. Again, in an earlier lecture, I think lecture 4, I tried to give different definitions of what we mean by culture, indicating that given an appropriate account of culture, many species can be considered to be cultural in the sense that they evidence within species variations of behavioral repertoires which are not genetically encoded and which are learned and transmitted down the generations within the species through social learning, which suggests, of course, that the opposition between culture and nature is misleading. In fact, in some kind of sense, culture is part of nature. And so perhaps we need a biological account of culture, and perhaps even a cultural account of human biology. You might think that this means that we need to turn to sociobiology, which is the common reductionist account, which suggests that cultural patterns are themselves due to genetic factors. No, that's not what I'm going to argue, although it is worth pointing out that one of the early pioneers of sociobiology, E.O. Wilson, has indeed made a similar point in advancing what he calls the theory of consilience. However, reductionism in the sense of sociobiology is not the only alternative. The theory of epigenesis proposes that, developmentally speaking, the constructivist relationship between biology and culture is a two-way street, not a one-way street of determination. An ecological approach to the language environment views language not as an input to an information processor, but as a support and constraint on effective organismic action. So the first part of this presentation proposes a theoretical synthesis of epigenetic and ecological approaches in an extended Darwinian framework. So part one is called Biology of Language, Ecology and Epigenesis. We have a standard story about evolution, which is given by the theoretical synthesis, which is called Neo-Darwinism. And the easiest way to outline this is to take it as a series of answers to a series of questions. The first question is, in Neo-Darwinism, what is the unit of selection? The unit of natural selection. And the answer to that is the gene, or in contemporary population genetics, populations or subpopulations of interacting genes. The next question is, in Neo-Darwinism, the theory of evolution through natural selection, what actually does the selecting? And there are basically two answers to this, or there are two mechanisms for doing the selecting. The first is the environment existing outside the species and its gene pool, as in natural selection. And that is, of course, the environment, including the inanimate environment, and also the environment as constituted by other species, predator species and prey species. And the other factor in selection is other genes from the same gene pool. And that is how sexual selection and kin selection work. So, in this theory of natural selection, supplemented by sexual and kin selection, the next question is, what actually is selected or selected for? What gives a gene an advantage over other genes, or a gene variant, an allele? And the answer to that is fitness. And the question then is, what do we mean by fitness? And the answer to that is differential reproductive success. That's the final criterion that's the final basis on which we can judge whether something has been selected for or not. In this neo-Darwinian story, there are actually a number of hidden problems which are not often referred to, but which are very important, I think. And the problem really is to do with what actually is selected, a problem which I call the problem of the site of selection. Firstly, genes do not come singly, but as combinations known as genotypes, which are packaged in organisms known as phenotypes. This is still standard stuff. So at the very least, it is organisms, not genes, which are subject to direct selection pressure. In other words, if we think about the process of reproduction, actually genes do not reproduce directly. Only organisms reproduce directly, and it's only through being packaged up in an organism that a gene can achieve differential reproductive success. So to put this technically, we can say that the replicator is the organism, not the gene. The thing that actually is the agency in replicating the genes is the organism. Now this is important because for understanding the developmental process that we call epigenesis, the level of organism, the descriptive and analytic level of organism is essential. Organisms, what are organisms? Organisms can be thought of, at least in most cases, as morphological individuals. That is to say, individuals which have got the shape and structure of the typical species organism. But even here, it has to be said that it is not essential that the organism be thought of as the morphological individual. And I will come to the reason why in a moment. But you can think, for example, of social insects, where it may be more appropriate to think of the entire colony of insects as being the kind of relevant organism which does the reproducing. But in any case, morphology itself, the morphological individual, is not the site of selection. That's not where selection pressure actually exerts itself. In fact, it is the functioning, behaving organism which is the replicator and the site of selection. Even when you think of sexual reproduction, for example, it's not, as it were, frozen morphological individuals, but behaving individuals which do the reproducing. And also in natural selection, it's the behavior of individuals, of morphological individuals, which make them more or less likely to survive the pressures of natural selection. And this is a point which is made, I'm far from being the first person to make this point. It was actually made by Jean Piaget, who emphasized what he called the leading role of behavior in evolution. And the leading role of behavior in evolution becomes increasingly important the higher we go up the evolutionary ladder, as it were. But it's something which is often forgotten by biologists, with their emphasis on the kind of microstructure of genetics, the statistical structure of population genetics, and the morphological structure of individual organisms. So what I want to say is that to really understand evolution in a way which is relevant for understanding the evolution of language, we need to have a variant of Darwinism which actually goes beyond the rather reductionist framework of neo-Darwinism. And in such a new synthesis, this must be based upon integrating ecology into evolution. Now, it might surprise you to know that, in fact, these two great branches of biology, evolutionary biology and ecology, are not actually theoretically well integrated with each other. It surprised me when I learned this as a non-biologist by training, but it is the truth. They're not very well integrated together. Although I will be coming on to talk about a theoretical account which I find particularly relevant, which does try to do exactly that integration. I don't know what this noise is. So, some criticisms, further criticisms of neo-Darwinism. Neo-Darwinism is based essentially upon population genetics, its contemporary version anyway, is based upon population genetics plus a shaky so-called central dogma. The central dogma being the irreversibility of the flow of information from gene to organism in the course of development. But the fundamental problem, apart from the kind of shakiness of some of its assumptions, is a problem of what it doesn't actually talk about. And in particular, neo-Darwinism neglects the causal role in the shaping of the environment by the organism. Because natural selection supposes that organisms are placed in environments which, as it were, shape the organism by selecting the genes. But it's not as simple as that. And that's the central point of ecological approaches in biology, which emphasize that actually organisms also shape their environments. Here are some simple examples, which are really very easy for a non-biologist to understand. They're so intuitive. Let's take first the example I call the path, the prey, and the predator. Many animals, all animals have to drink. Many animals move from one place to another, and when they need to drink, they go to a particular place, for example, a waterhole, in order to drink. If they repeatedly move between two places, their movement creates a path because the vegetation gets beaten down. This path then becomes part of the environment. And as a matter of fact, it's a useful part of the environment for the animal which is moving between the watering place and another place. And it kind of canalizes their movement. But imagine now that this animal is subject to predation by a predator. Imagine the animal is something like an antelope and the predator is something like a lion or a tiger. What can actually happen is that the predator can figure out that the path is a place where you find the prey on a regular basis, and it can lie in wait along that path. And as a matter of fact, that's exactly what happens. They do that. They learn that. So, the activity of the organism sets up a new aspect of the environment, which then not only becomes part of the effective environment for the organism's locomotion, but actually becomes part of the circuit of selection itself. A second, slightly different example is the hoof of the horse and the steppe. Now, the great steppes of northern Asia are grasslands. And as you know, horses evolved in these grasslands. That's where horses come from. And horses' hooves are feet which are very well adapted to such grasslands. But what you also have to appreciate is that in a way, the steppe and the hoof of the horse actually co-evolved. Because over many hundreds of generations of horses' hooves pounding this steppe, it actually created the environmental conditions for extensive grasslands. And many environments are such that if you take away the species which live in that environment, the actual vegetation of the environment changes. A third example brings us closer and closer to language in a way. It's the example of what we might call animal artifacts, animals which actually make things in their environment. Two examples. Beavers. Beavers chop down trees to make dams. These dams dam up the water, and they create a wetland environment in which both beavers and some other species exist, and to which they are adapted. But the dams would not exist without the activity of the beavers. And the dams can be thought of as a sort of animal artifact which then constitutes part of their environment. Another example is bowerbirds. Bowerbirds are a species of bird found mainly through Southeast Asia and Australasia. And like many birds, the male of the species produces displays in order to attract the female, in order to mate with the female. But whereas in the case of most birds, including, for example, peacocks, the display that they make is with their body, or some part of their body. The display is part of the morphology of the animal, like the tail of the peacock. In the case of the bowerbird, the bowerbird actually makes a display because it creates a nest and goes out and finds lots of shiny, pretty things, objects in the environment, stones, leaves, feathers, and anything which can, with which the bowerbird can decorate their nest in order to make it visually attractive to the female, which the male bowerbird then invites to come and live in the nest and mate with him. So the bowerbird, again, in this case, is actually, while the beaver is, as it were, modulating the process of natural selection by creating an artifact, the bowerbird is modulating the process of sexual selection by building a nest. My final example is termite mounds and ant hills and the notion of the group organism. As you know, termites and ants live in colonies, and these colonies live in structures which are made by the insect. The structure is made out of earth, and it is an essential part of the environment of the colony. The colony would not exist without this structure. It would be far too vulnerable to predation. And of course, we know that, for example, chimpanzees are able to use twigs of wood to sort of fish for termites in termite mounds. But of course, if there was no mound, the chimpanzee wouldn't need to use tools to try and get the termites. They'd just pick them up off the ground to eat them. And these particular artifacts, which are places to live, are extremely intricate, and they involve a sort of division of labor between the different kind of specialisms of the termite or ant. And in a way, we can almost say that ants form and termites form a sort of group organism, which is partly coextensive with the artifact of the mound or heap. Now, at this point, I want to introduce a concept from psychology, and in particular from James Gibson's ecological psychology, the concept of affordance. In Gibson's ecological psychology, affordances constitute the environment for effective action and perception. That is, for the organization of behavior. An affordance is something in the environment with which the animal can do something. So, for example, for many animals, branches of trees are climbable and perhaps swing-onable. A stone can be something that can be sit-onable. And, or for that matter, a stone is something that might be throwable. Now, Gibson said that actually, in terms of animal perception, the way that we ought to look at the environment is, as it were, as a set of invitations to behave in certain ways, ways in which the animal is actually adapted for. So the environment for effective action consists of all the relevant affordances for that particular animal species. But Gibson actually neglects the fact that affordances may, in fact, be constructed by the animal. That's why I call this slide Constructing Your Own Affordances. Nests are for nesting in, burrows are for burrowing, and so on. And they're actually constructed by the animal. Now, this tells us something and suggests something about the process of natural selection. Remember that earlier on I said, look, we can't say that even if the unit of selection in genetic theory, and particularly population of genetics, even if we agree, which I think we should agree, that the unit of selection is the gene is not the site of selection because selection pressures do not operate directly on the gene. So I suggested, following Piaget, that the site of selection should be thought of as the behaving, functioning organism. But in the light of our considerations about animal artifacts and self-constructed niches with affordances, we should say that in such cases, the site of selection can be considered to be the organism in its self-constructed niche, or an organism-niche coupling. And this is actually a model which has been developed by a group of biologists, Kevin Laland and his colleagues, and they have constructed a model on the basis of this, in which they come up with a new term, phenogenotype. It is a horrible word, I agree, but that's the word they use. A phenogenotype can be considered to be a species-specific organism-niche combination which is functionally equivalent to an organism. As a matter of fact, and rather interestingly, the father of reductionist sociobiology himself, Richard Dawkins, has also suggested something similar, although he's never really kind of followed it up in his popular science books. He calls it the extended phenotype, which perhaps is an easier term than phenogenotype, but anyway, never mind. My definition of this would be a class of interacting genes in a bound but not genetically determined relationship with some aspect of a self-constructed environment. And actually, I should have said, at least not wholly genetically determined relationship, because of course some of the behaviors which give rise to the construction of animal artifacts are themselves actually innate behaviors. But nonetheless, even if these behaviors are innate, there is usually some learning component as well. So the relationship with the self-constructed environment is not wholly genetically determined. So anyway, the important thing is that the site of selection is now organism plus artifact, or organism plus niche. What does this tell us, or what kind of things might it suggest to us about human culture and language? From an ecological evolutionary point of view, culture is phenogenotypic. At the same time, it's a rather, as I've also stressed through many of these lectures, human culture is also unique in the animal kingdom because human culture is symbolic and linguistic. So that what I want to suggest to you is that we should see language as an artifact niche, analogously with the dams of beavers, for example. And the capacity to use and acquire language involves the evolution and replication of a phenogenotypical biocultural complex. So to put this succinctly, the human language capacity is phenogenotypic. It's not something that is just inscribed in the genes. That doesn't mean genes have got nothing to do with it. It just means that language itself is not in the form of some kind of universal grammar there in the genes. How then do individuals acquire language? It's at this point that the notion of epigenetic development, as developed by the biologist C.H. Waddington and the developmental psychologist Jean Piaget, comes into play. Epigenetic development is an ontogenetic developmental process. It's a process of development of the individual organism. And it involves the following aspects. It involves the elaboration of a relatively simple initial state or initial behavioral repertoire into a more complex one, into a more complex and elaborate state or repertoire. Epigenetic development is constructive. It is not just the expression of genes. Because in epigenesis, the environment is part of the process of construction. It plays a constructive role. The environment is taken up into the developmental process. Thirdly, epigenetic development is unidirectional. In this, it's unlike classical learning. So epigenesis is neither just instinct, the expression of genes, nor just learning. It is really development, and it is really constructive. For example, I mean, to illustrate the difference with learning, if you do classical learning experiments of the kind of thing that that behaviorist psychologists used to do, for example, teaching rats to run a maze or pigeons to peck a target in a particular order, you can teach them to do these kinds of things, but you can also extinguish the learned response very easily. In epigenesis, you cannot extinguish what has been developed, not unless some catastrophe occurs to the organism. And this unidirectionality of development is one reason why biologists recognize that there is a reality to the directionality of time's arrow. Epigenetic time goes from past to future, and you can't reverse it and run it backwards. You can't turn the tape back. So it's irreversible. Here are two examples of epigenetic development. The first one is birdsong. Many of you may know about this, but anyway. Songbirds, when they hatch, already can sing. Or very shortly after hatching, they already can sing. But what they sing is an incredibly kind of basic song. They sing a sort of unelaborated version of the song. As the songbird develops, and on condition that it is actually exposed to the song of adults in its community. It's usually the male that sings, by the way, but not always. On condition that they're actually exposed to that adult model, they will acquire the full-blown song of their community, and the bird song will become elaborated over time, quite rapidly. Another interesting thing is, even within the same species of songbird, different songbird communities of that same species will have different versions of the mature song. So they'll have a kind of dialect, or you might say they have different languages in the bird song. And that suggests, if we accept that, even though there is a genetic basis to bird song, it's not genetically determined. It does vary, and the kind of variation that is involved, which is within the same species, can rightly be called cultural. If that's true, songbirds have culture, and if it's true also, the process of epigenesis is actually a developmental process which is actually associated with cultural variation. And now my other example, obviously enough, is human natural language. Human languages, I suggest, are acquired in an epigenetic process. And I would further say that the importance of this is that under an epigenetic process, there is absolutely no reason to suppose that in the initial state of development, everything about the final state is already there as part of the information. It just isn't. So we can contrast epigenetic development with the kind of model that Chomsky has put forward. Thank you very much. In his principles and parameters model of language acquisition, in which all the environment does is select between one or more predetermined patterns of development. In epigenesis, it's not a matter of predetermination and selection. It's a matter of co-construction between organism and its genetic endowment and the environment. Here's a definition of epigenesis. In epigenesis, the developmental trajectory and final form of the developing behavior are a consequence both of the environmental information and of the genetically encoded information. A genetically specified initial behavioral repertoire is elaborated through experience of a relevant environment, yielding an envelope of potential trajectories and outcomes. The process of elaboration is directional, and once it's taken place, the initial plasticity of the embryonic or unelaborated repertoire is largely, although not necessarily, wholly lost. So epigenesis involves a developmental transition from relative organismic plasticity and informational openness to relative rigidity and informational closure. And what that means is that early in the process of development, the organism is highly open to environmental information, which is used in the constructive process. But as this process of construction continues, in order to conserve the developmental advances that have already been made, the organism becomes much more and more specialized in the information which it's prepared to take in and becomes closed to other forms of information. And that's what makes development irreversible. And that's why, for example, it is the case that young children are better at learning language than older children or adults. And in nativist theories, this is often theorized in terms of a thing called a critical period for language acquisition. Now, what I'm saying is that it's not really a matter of critical period, or it's not so much, or the critical period is kind of a symptom of the general process of epigenetic development. It's a consequence of the way that epigenesis actually works. Epigenesis is absolutely fundamental for understanding the role of development in our species, the species which the biological anthropologist Terry Deacon calls the symbolic species. What makes humans unique is not an innate language acquisition device, plus a variety of other species-specific innate cognitive modules, but a generalized semiotic or symbolic capacity, which is epigenetically developed from a suite of cognitive capacities largely shared with other species, but attaining higher levels of organization in humans. And so therefore it is compatible with the fact that such a very large proportion of our genetic material is indeed shared with our closest relatives, the chimpanzees. Now, learning and using a language. What implications does this have? I want to make a proposal to you which, in the light of most contemporary theories of language and language acquisition, might appear to be radical. My proposal is that if we ask ourselves, where is the grammar of a language? The answer is, the grammar of the language is in the language. Now, this goes against a whole lot of assumptions which we have been, as it were, led to make by Chomsky and by other generative linguists, but primarily by Chomsky, who have claimed that the external grammars of languages, the grammar, as it were, that we observe in everyday speech around us, is but a sort of degenerated and secondary version of the real grammar, and the real grammar is inside people's heads, what Chomsky calls the I language. And I'm saying no, absolutely wrong. In fact, as you'll see, I don't even think there is an I language in the Chomskyan sense. The grammar of the language is in the language, just as the structure of the nest is in the nest. The capacity for language is thus a cognitive behavioral relationship between the language user and the constituents of language, just as the capacity for building a nest is a cognitive behavioral relationship between the builder and the constituents of the nest. And it's this relationship this relationship between organism and artifact niche that has, in each case, been selected for in evolution. That means there is no need for the organism to possess an internal model of the grammar of a language to account for language acquisition, any more than the building of a nest requires an internal model of the nest. When a bowerbird builds a nest, it doesn't have, as it were, a genetically encoded grammar of the nest. Of course, the building of the bowerbird's nest is under genetic control. Nobody's denying that. Nobody's denying that it's an innate capacity in some significant way. But the nature of this innate capacity is not a model or a plan or a grammar of the nest. It's actually a behavioral repertoire which enables the bowerbird to go out and make use of the constituents to hand in order to build a nest. And I'm suggesting that exactly the same is the case for language. We don't need to have a grammar in the head in order to acquire grammar. We construct grammar on the basis of, indeed, an initial state which is genetically specified, but then we create it and construct it. We co-construct it on the basis of what is made available from the environment, including the utterances of language and including the shape. Excuse me. And including also the tutorial behaviors, if you like, of the caretakers around the child. Here is a general point about this. I've made a lot of the importance of epigenesis. Epigenesis is something which, or it's a process which becomes more and more important in the higher animals because it's advantageous for organisms in which phenogenotypic couplings are both frequent and variable. And that's a pretty appropriate general description of the human cultural organism. A lot of variability in what we construct around us, and an awful lot of cultural forms which we do create. And that suggests that regulatory genes augmenting epigenetic openness, I'm not going to go into the biology of this, but it is to do with the timing of the opening and closing of developmental windows. These genes can therefore be expected to have been phenogenotypically selected for in the human genome, which in turn permits further adaptive selection for domain-specific learning in the semiotic biocultural complex, and in particular for language. So please note that in opposing the nativist account of language acquisition, I'm opposing an account which posits or proposes the idea of an innate universal grammar. I'm not saying there's nothing innate about our capacity to acquire language. There surely is, but it doesn't take the form of a sort of plan for language or universal grammar. So I'm claiming that the class of organisms with the language capacity, which is normally developing humans, is a phenogenotypic replicator systemically associated with a wider biocultural complex of symbolic and constructive cognitive capacities. And individual language acquisition and use is therefore situated in the context of actuation of these interrelated capacities. and is therefore profoundly socially and semiotically contextual. In other words, our capacity to use and acquire language is a cultural phenomenon. Or more precisely, it is a biocultural phenomenon. It is not something which is reducible to something just in the brain. So the language artifact niche is culturally and materially situated, that is, dynamically embedded within a semiotic network which includes other symbolic and non-symbolic artifacts, which is a point that brings me back to the things that I've been emphasizing in the last couple of lectures about the importance of artifacts in human cognitive development and language acquisition. I'm not going to go. So I think I'm at the end of part one now. I'm just going to say, instead of reading out this slide because it's rather long, I'm just going to say that this notion of the biocultural niche and of language as part of our biocultural niche is basically saying that language is part of our extended embodiment in the sense in which I have used the term extended embodiment in my earlier lectures. And this is really, really important. And I'll tell you why I emphasize this, because it's a different perspective than the usual embodiment perspective offered by cognitive linguists like Lakoff and Johnson. You see, I'm not saying only language is, as it were, based in embodiment, all right? Lakoff and Johnson say that language is based in embodiment, and by that they mean organic, physical, corporeal embodiment. They say that we have language because we have embodiment. I'm saying, no, that's wrong. Actually, language is part of extended embodiment in the same way that our artifactual world, the world that we make around us, our cultural world, is, in fact, extended embodiment. Okay? So this perspective, although it's very much within the general tradition of cognitive linguistics and cognitive semantics, does actually have a quite different view of what we might call the ontology of language. It's not so much an effect of embodiment as a part of embodiment in the sense of extended embodiment. And extended embodiment is really what it means to be human, to be a human biocultural being. Okay, that was really, and you've seen this one before, so I'm not going to go through it again. That was the end of part one. And I did warn a couple of you before we started that this is a bit of a longer lecture than some of the others. And my final lecture tomorrow maybe will be shorter, I don't know. Now, having looked, the second part of my title for this lecture is Language as a Social Fact and Social Institution. Again here, what I'm trying to do is to break down the kind of opposition between the biological and the socio-cultural. But in this particular part of the lecture, what I'm doing is I'm going back to an earlier tradition in linguistics, very much informed by classical social theory, which involved reflection on the nature of human social life, and thereby on the methods which are necessary for the study of human social life. The relevant person here is Émile Durkheim, the great French sociologist. Can be found in science from 100 years ago or more, including Darwinism, including Marx's historical materialism as interpreted by Vygotsky, and including Durkheim, who I'm now going to talk about. And of course, Durkheim was extremely influential on the linguistic theories of Saussure, who said explicitly that language should be viewed as a social institution, as something which almost disappeared from contemporary linguistics when Chomsky came along and, as it were, insisted on the primacy of the I language. Anyway, here is what Durkheim says about social facts. He says, they are a category of facts which present very special characteristics. They consist of manners of acting, thinking, and feeling. Note that acting, thinking, and feeling, a whole complex of the cognitive, the behavioral, and the affective. Yeah? External to the individual, which are invested with a coercive power by virtue of which they exercise control over him. So they're kind of ways of doing things or types of conduct which invest a coercive power because they force in some way the individual to imitate or emulate that way of doing things. And social facts are coercive precisely because they are exterior to the individual. So the objectivity of social facts thus consists in the fact that they are independent of any single individual's thoughts or will. So social facts are essentially normative. That's one of the things about them. Social facts are normative because they are prescriptive. They tell you how things should be, not just how things are. Social facts are about the ought of life as well as just the is. But they're also coercive and objective in the sense that they place limitations on the kind of ways that you can think and ways that you can do and ways that you can talk. And all social institutions consist of social facts, according to Durkheim. Social facts are, according to Durkheim, irreducible to psychological facts, structures, or processes, though they depend upon these and also influence them. Social facts can be objects of shared, mutual, intersubjective knowledge, and language is a social fact or social institution. There are many other social facts and social institutions. For example, a good example of a social institution is the family. And a good example of a social fact is the fact that in many cultures, including my own, it is a normative fact that a person cannot be married to more than one other person. And in that sense, that's the sense in which the social fact is coercive, because it's prescriptive. And of course, such a social fact can be the object of common knowledge, and in fact it is generally assumed that it is the object of common knowledge. These are things that you should know as a member of society. And of course they're things which are very strongly impressed upon the developing human in the course of their development. But the important thing for our current purposes, before we digress too much, is that language is a social fact, or better, language is a social institution, and that it has a normative character, a point that has been repeatedly emphasized by the Finnish linguist Esa Itkonen. Now, Durkheim may have been the person who introduced the terminology of social facts, but more recently, the American philosopher John Searle has had a lot to say about social facts, though without, strangely enough, ever referencing Durkheim. And he uses this as a way of trying to understand certain facts about the social world, which otherwise he maintains would be inexplicable, such as institutions such as money. And this is what Searle says about social or institutional facts. He says they take the general form of X something counts as Y, whatever that is, in some kind of context C. An example from Searle: a $20 bill counts as a monetary token with this particular exchange value of $20. Now, I'm saying, this is not Searle's own terminology, but I'm saying that actually what he's trying to do is to give us, or what he quite successfully does, is give us a general semiotic ontology of the nature of social facts, because social facts are irreducible to physical structure. There's nothing in the this is something I talked about yesterday. There's nothing in the paper of a $20 bill. You can get a microscope, you can get an electron microscope, you can go as far down as you like into the atomic structure of that $20 bill, and nowhere will you find an exchange value of $20. It's just not there in the physical ontology. It's a social ontology, but it's also an ontology of meaning, and therefore a semiotic ontology. But do note something which is important for the rest of what I say. The $20 note does not stand for or represent $20. It's not like a linguistic sign in that sense. In fact, the note is $20. It's not that the $20 bill is a representation or a sign for $20. It is $20. It's self-identical. Its value is, to use the philosophical term, subtended by, though irreducible to its material existence, because if you destroy the note, you destroy the value. If you burn a $20 bill, that $20 is gone. Yeah? This prompts some interesting reflections on the current financial crisis and the destruction of value and how it happens. Now let me return to something, I think it was in lecture 3, about the nature of representation, which I want to distinguish from Searle's notion of counting as. And I defined there, following my book from 1988, the conditions of representation as follows. To represent something is to cause something else to stand for it in such a way that both the relationship of standing for and that which is intended to be represented can be recognized. And let's just give, in the same way that Searle gives a definition of counting for, let's give a definition of the standing for relationship, which I will claim is something like this, where a sign stands for a meaning in some kind of context, but we can elaborate that to mean that something, X, counts as a sign, and that sign stands for the meaning. So Searle's definition of counting as is incorporated into the definition of representation. And this simple notation clarifies the old linguistic notion of the double articulation of the sign, but which is the conventional unity of substance and signification. And the context may now include the entire sign system and the community of users. Now, when we do formal stuff like this, when I first did this, it kind of surprised me that I wanted to go into this sort of formalism because I've never been a formal linguist. But nonetheless, I found it useful. But one thing I do know is that it's not the kind of thing that it's easy to go through in a lecture. So I will read it out, but I'm not going to try and explain it. I'll let you, if you're interested, find your way through it at your leisure at some other time. But there is a point that I want to make, and that is that using this notation or formalism, it is possible to distinguish by just using these two simple notions of counting as and standing for, and formally interarticulating them. It is actually possible to distinguish between the traditional principal subsystems of language, or at least those subsystems of language which are most relevant for our current purposes in terms of meaning. I haven't bothered with phonology. And those principal subsystems are grammar, semantics, and pragmatics. So I'm not going to go through this. Some consequences of this. The semantic theory of meaning is underdetermined by this formulation and need not be truth functional. This is really important. The semantics of a language does presuppose that we can define a grammar, indeed that we can define a language. That's all we need. We don't have to say anything about the relationship between that language and anything outside itself, except that there is some community for which the language exists as a conventional system. So the semantic theory of meaning need not be truth functional, but it is conventional and normative, as are all the subsystems. And being conventional and normative, that means they are all social facts, or configurations of social facts. That means that we can distinguish pragmatics from semantics without necessitating a truth-functional semantics. And that, I think, is an important result, because, as you know, and as I will talk about tomorrow, I'll try and expand this a bit tomorrow, it's been an important characteristic, an important theoretical claim of cognitive linguistics, cognitive semantics and cognitive grammar, that meaning is not, that meaning in natural language cannot be adequately captured within an objectivist framework. And objectivist frameworks are truth functional. And it's also been the case that, that almost all theorists have tried to distinguish semantics from pragmatics by saying that semantics is truth functional, whereas pragmatics is not. Pragmatics in the classic formulation is something to do with implicature. And in fact, Searle himself follows that line. And I'm saying that we can actually, and for that reason, cognitive linguists have tended to say we cannot distinguish between semantics and pragmatics. There is no distinction. And I'm saying we can distinguish between semantics and pragmatics, and we don't need a truth-functional semantics to do that. And therefore, cognitive linguistics just like other more traditional linguistic theories, is quite at liberty to distinguish between semantics and pragmatics. You may find it difficult to draw the dividing line at times, but the distinction in principle is there, and it's clear. However, unlike in objectivist theories, contextual dependence characterizes all subsystems. Language is irreducibly context-bound, but it does not erase the distinctions between the subsystems. And finally, language as a social object has its own proper structure subtended by, but irreducible to human intentionality. And it's irreducible to intentionality because it's a kind of, because once it becomes a social fact and a social institution, it becomes relatively autonomous from and independent of any single human will or intention. Right. A summary. And I think I'll leave the rest of, after I've given this summary of this lecture, I'll leave the rest until tomorrow because it kind of follows into that lecture more appropriately. What is special about human culture is not its mere existence, but its symbolic nature. Other animals too have culture, or other species have culture. We have symbolic culture. Language is an artifact niche, not an input to be internalized as internal structure. Language is situated by other semiotic artifacts. The human language capacity is not innate, but epigenetically developed and phenogenotypic. There is no mental grammar. Well, I have to be careful here. I do believe we can have a knowledge of grammar, of course, like we can have a knowledge of any other social institution. You and I share all sorts of knowledge about social institutions. So, for example, I have a certain knowledge of the rules of football, but there are other people who have a better knowledge of that. Okay. And I also have a knowledge of the rules of language. And there are probably other people who have a better knowledge of that than me. It is not the case that my knowledge of language is something which is unlike other kinds of knowledge. It's not like... So what I mean is there is no sort of kind of pre-existent knowledge of language which is somehow of a different order than other kinds of knowledge. Okay, that's what I mean by there is no mental grammar. Grammar is a social institution normatively regulating conduct, and we learn what is necessary to act in it. And I'll just repeat, to conclude this, something about language acquisition, which is a sort of metaphor, which is based on this, you know, everybody, I mean, it's been quite common in history in the history of thinking about language for people to draw analogies between languages and games, you know. So Saussure, I think, talked about no, I'm not sure about Saussure. I think he did talk about, make an analogy between language and chess or something like that, yeah. And Wittgenstein said language was like a game, and he actually said it is a game in a sense. He talked about language games. Well, my little metaphor of language acquisition would go something like this. Imagine you've got a group of people of different ages playing a football game. And of course, some of them are experts and really know the rules of football, but they can also play it much better. And others are less expert, but they're still pretty good at kicking the ball around. And then you've got some real little novices who are just getting into it for the first time. and they're the ones who are like the kind of children in the early stages of language acquisition. But still, they join in, right? They join in the game. That's the point. And you can really say that they're all using language. It's not as if they haven't got language, all right? It's not as if they have yet to acquire the whole thing. Of course, there's all sorts of expertise and knowledge they have yet to get. But they are already users of language, and it's through their participation, to use a term that I've also repeatedly emphasized, it's through their participation, not through abstract processes of induction of rules. It's through their participation that they actually become competent language users, learning what is necessary to act in that social institution. Okay, thank you very much.